My name is Trinity, and if you are here, you must be here to talk about books. And today, I am going to be doing the Fantasy Reader book tag. I saw this on Leanne's library, and of course, everywhere else on BookTube because I'm a fantasy reader and I follow fantasy blogs. And it seems like everybody has done this video, except for me. If you hear snoring in the background, I am sorry. My dog has been fighting me all morning while I try to record these videos, and so he is now laying behind me, beside me, and I finally got him to calm down a little bit. So the first question is, what is your fantasy origin story? So for that, me and Leanne have the same answer. And Leanne pointed out that we can't count this because he says he does not write fantasy. Terry Goodkind's Wizard's First Rule. I fell in love with fantasy because of this book. I understand that Terry Goodkind is not the greatest person in the world, or wasn't. He passed away recently. Bad to talk ill of the dead. But he wasn't the nicest person, and he was very stuck on himself and his writing. However, I'm going to echo what Leanne said and say this series is great for beginners because it shows so many fantasy elements and tropes that will get you into reading fantasy, prepare you for what else the genre has to offer. And, you know, if you decide to read Wizard's First Rule as a veteran of fantasy, I could see why you wouldn't like this series. I could definitely see why you wouldn't like this series. However, it is nostalgic for me now because it was my first venture into fantasy, and I happen to adore it for that reason alone, and I will always love Wizard's First Rule because of that. The second question is, if you could be the hero or heroine of a fantasy novel, who would be the author and what's one trope you'd insist on in the story? So I would have to go with Sanderson. Definitely have to go with Sanderson, and I would be like, all right, Sanderson, time to write an anti-hero into your stories, because that would be what I would be. I would either be a mage or a rogue, and I would love to see Sanderson take on that trope in a different capacity than Vin, because Vin is not necessarily an anti-hero. She wants to do good, and she wants to be the hero of her story. So I would definitely have to go with Sanderson and rogue or mage and anti-hero. Number 3, what is a fantasy that you have read this year that you want more people to read? So I know I am not alone in loving the Lightbringer series. However, since it is an older series, well, the start of it is older, I would like more people to talk to me about Lightbringer Brent Weeks and things like that, because I don't know a lot of people who like Brent Weeks. I know I am in the lower end minority of women who actually like Brent Weeks. So it would be nice to find others who do. Question number 4, what is your favorite fantasy subgenre, and what is a subgenre you would like to read more from? So a fantasy genre that I love is probably going to be grimdark. I do have a tendency to like more grimdark stuff than I do of epic and heroic fantasy. I like morally gray characters, so that tends to be found more in grimdark than anything else. And one that I haven't read much of that I would like to read more of is Flintlock Fantasy. And I have The Thousand Names by Django Wexler, and I have Promise of Blood on my shelves. So I really would like to read those and see if I like Flintlock Fantasy, if it's something that I'm going to enjoy and want more of. But I haven't actually dipped my toes into that subgenre yet, so we shall see. Number 5, who is one of your auto-buy authors? So I have a whole video of this, but fantasy in particular, Brandon Sanderson would be at the top. Anthony Ryan, when he writes fantasy, that's definitely an auto-buy. He is my favorite author. Brent Weeks, if he ever puts anything else out, I will definitely be buying from him. John Gwen, I have really enjoyed the Faithful and the Fallen series, so I will be picking up whatever else he puts out. I do have Shadow of the Gods as an ARC, so I will buy it when it comes out. And Leigh Bardugo. I really like Leigh Bardugo. She is young adult fantasy, but I have really enjoyed everything that she's written as well. What is an upcoming fantasy release that you are excited for? Okay, I did mention Shadow of the Gods just now, so let's think of something else. Oh, The Pariah, Anthony Ryan. He is putting out a new book, so I'm very excited for that, and I have requested an ARC. I hope I get one. And I would really like a physical ARC because you guys know my issues with ebooks, so let's cross our fingers and hope that I get a physical. How do you typically find fantasy recommendations? So I watch a lot of BookTube. However, my tastes are a little bit different than everybody else's on BookTube. I have noticed that, and I'm okay with that. That's totally fine. But I will link a couple of booktubers that I think give pretty good recommendations. However, be forewarned, I don't read the exact same things as them. But Twitter, a lot of my fantasy recommendations come from book blogs on Twitter. And I am a book blogger. I have been blogging for 7 years, and the group that I have found on Twitter, I really trust their recommendations. Patrick, I really trust his recommendations. Peter, Sam, David, I will link their blogs down below as well. But I always trust their recommendations, and they do tend to read the same types of books that I do. So while I do appreciate all of the booktubers that I follow, my tastes don't always align with them. Number 8, what is one misconception about fantasy you would like to lay to rest? I have a feeling that every fantasy reader is going to have the same answer, and that is that fantasy is not deep. Fantasy is not anything you can apply to your real life situations. I have yet to come across a fantasy that I was like, oh, this was pointless. Most fantasy touches on some pretty hard topics. It covers real life situations. Like, you would be amazed at how many fantasy novels pull from what is going on today and uses those influences for what they're writing. It is really, really rich and deep and explored in ways that most people don't consider. And I really love that. Like, grief, racism, capitalism, all different forms of government are deconstructed in fantasy worlds. And so I really, really love that about fantasy. I do love a good political fantasy, so those are really high up on my list of likes. And I think a lot of people want to say fantasy is about dragons and magic and it's dumb, And I was one of those people. Again, fantasy is a new thing to me. I say new. So since I started book blogging, that's when I started reading fantasy. I said 5 years ago. I have been leaning on that for a long time and forgetting that I need to add 2 years to that. So 7 years, but I did have a 2-year reading slump. So I still consider it 5 years. I have really, really glommed on to the genre, and I really love it for everything that it does. So again, I think almost all fantasy readers are going to have that same answer. Number 9, if someone had ever read a fantasy before and asked you to recommend the first 3 books that come to mind as places to start, what would those recommendations be? Places to start in fantasy are definitely Mistborn. I would still recommend Wizard's First Rule because, like I said, it is full of a lot of elements that you will find throughout all fantasy books. Even though it's not the best written fantasy out there, it definitely will get you started in the genre. And another beginner, Truth Witch by Susan Dennard, I think would also be a good starting place if you're wanting to get into more adult fantasy, because it is new adult, so it is very easy to read, and it does have some of the things typically found in young adult, but it is also a lot more mature than a lot of the young adult that you read now. Number 10, who is the most recent fantasy reading content creator you've come across that you'd like to shout out? Oh, this is a hard one because most of the people that I follow are pretty established, and I honestly don't know the answer to this because, Abby Salter, she's fairly new to BookTube. However, she has garnered a larger following than I have, and I love her content. Her content is really, really original, and I love that she comes up with these new ideas all the time. I am trying to get to that level, so hopefully I will get to that level. And, goals. All right, that is it for the Get to Know the Fantasy Reader tag. And I also want to throw out that in the past, I have had issues with people saying that I am a fantasy blog, and I'm less inclined to be mad about that statement now than I was a few months ago because I do read a lot of fantasy. However, my blog is definitely a book blog. It is not a fantasy blog, but I do read a lot more fantasy than I do any other genre. So you can go ahead and call me a fantasy blog. I'll take it. But like, subscribe, do all the fun things, and I will see you guys in my next video. Bye.